sure that all of you have really appreciated the work of the Heritage Foundation. What a blessing to have that kind of research available at our fingertips. And Leo has been politically active for some time, starting in 2005. In the wake of the legislative pay raise in Harrisburg, Leo got active politically. He volunteered with an organization which in 2005 worked to successfully deny a sitting Pennsylvania State Supreme Court Justice retention for the first time in state history. Who was that justice?
Russell Nigra.
Right. I remember that being mentioned. That's quite an accomplishment. And this same group was affiliated with over 100 candidates for the State House and Senate in 2006. As a volunteer, Leo worked on strategy, messaging, and filed state financial reports. Since that time, he has been active in his home county and has volunteered with numerous campaigns for state and local office. In January 2011, this year, Leo was named the Pennsylvania State Director for Heritage Action for America. And did Heritage Action just get started this year?
We're 19 or like 14 months old, so.
Right, so it's fairly recent. Okay, so he's going to tell us more about the organization, how we can get involved in it, and he's also going to address the issues on the economy and the debt ceiling and hopefully answer some of our questions. So thank you very much, Leo.
So I put together a really nice slideshow, and I forgot my projector because I got a phone call right as I was getting ready to walk out the door. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to email Jamie the link. It's actually, the slideshow is actually online, so she can distribute it to everybody, so you can take a look at it. Because I got some nice charts and everything. You'll just have to take my word that it looks good. So Heritage Action for America, you're familiar with the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Action for America, as I just kind of mentioned, we are a relatively young organization. In July, we celebrated our first year of actually being around. I've been on board with Heritage Action since January of this year. Basically what we do is we work towards making the conservative policy positions of the Heritage Foundation a reality, a political reality. The way that the law is set up, there's certain things that they're not able to do, so they set up a separate organization, and we take their research and actually apply it to specific pieces of legislation, and we try and make sure that people are aware of what's happening in Washington, D.C. as it relates to kind of advancing more conservative positions. What we do is we ensure that members of Congress hear from the over 700,000 members of the Heritage Foundation, along with millions of other Americans who believe in the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual responsibility, traditional American values, and strong national defense. Those are the key areas that we focus on. So, one of the things that you wanted to talk about was the economy and kind of why we're in this kind of low growth, no growth, kind of stagnant, whatever you want to call it. It's not a recession technically because there's a specific definition that goes along with recession that we're not in. But I think everybody can agree that we're not in a good place economically in the country. So why are we having the issues that we're having? One of the big things that it's important to keep in mind is that throughout history, one of the things that researchers have found when they've looked at numbers is once you hit 100% of debt to GDP, your economic growth slows or basically stagnates in a pretty dramatic fashion. Prior to increasing the debt ceiling, when you looked at federal debt, we were in, if you just looked at the like Treasury debt and that kind of stuff, it was in the neighborhood of 85 to 90%, depending on how you measured GDP. So we were very close to it, and that's just at the federal level. When you added in state and local and all those other kinds of debts, we actually exceeded 100%. At this point, with the latest batch of increases to debt, we're actually at 100% debt to GDP, regardless of how you measure it. So that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem why we're in the situation that we're in. So where's all this? Where's the problems when it comes to debt? What are the issues that we're looking at? What are the main cost drivers? And kind of what can we do about them? One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight is the super committee that's going to be started as a result of the latest debt ceiling increase. What's their goal? What's the plan? What are they up to? And I wanted to talk a little bit about the debt drivers and kind of how that relates to what the super committee is actually going to be able to accomplish. One thing that it's kind of important to recognize is that, generally speaking, the U.S. government has been able to collect roughly 18% of their GDP in terms of taxes. So tax receipts equals about 18%. That's a historic average. Part of the problem is that we're now spending in the neighborhood of 22%. The federal government is spending 22% of GDP. So structurally, kind of regardless of what the tax rate is, that 18% has held pretty constant in terms of what they're able to do. And that just seems to be kind of what the limit is in terms of what their collection ability is. Keep in mind that number for a second. If you go out to the year 2050, we'll actually be consuming all of that 18% just in terms of, well, actually by 2050 it'll be well above that, but we'll be consuming that 18%. Medicare and Medicaid will basically eat up the entire amount. So just two Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, kind of lump that in there at this point because it is the law. God willing, it won't be, but at this point, using that as a baseline. So we're spending a lot more money than we're taking in, and we're going to continue to spend a lot more money than we're taking in, just because of the structural problems that there are with the Medicare system. Medicare is really one of the prime drivers, but the Social Security system, despite what anybody tells you, isn't solvent. We can't kind of continue along that path either. So we have a lot of problems, and that's just in those programs. Those are, the main cost drivers, and they are eating up a tremendous amount of what we're able to spend. So each American's share of the national debt, as you can imagine, is also growing. Some of these numbers are terrifying. So right in 2011, the projected number is $31,871 per person. That's every man, woman, and child at over $38,000 is what our share of the national debt is. If you go out to 2032, so go out 21 years, so that would be any kids kind of born today, go out to their 21st birthday, and they'll be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $103,000. And the numbers actually get much worse after that. When you look at the chart, rather than just being kind of this gentle slope, it actually explodes up. So it's pretty drastic in terms of what the trajectory looks like. Which is one of the reasons that when the debt ceiling debate was going on, that Heritage Action, along with a lot of other conservative groups, we took the position that we didn't want the debt ceiling raised unless Congress enacted cut, cap, and balance. That was the position that we took, and I'd be more than happy to answer some questions as to why we weren't, just no and that kind of stuff, because that plan was the only one on the table that would actually change the trajectory of the debt seal of our debt accumulation. And what the cut, cap, and balance plan did was it capped the percentage of GDP. The constitutional amendment that was going along with that actually did some pretty interesting things. One of the things that it did was it capped spending at a percentage of GDP. It capped it at 18%, which, going back to that kind of historic average for what the government can collect, that was the maximum that they could spend. It also did some other things, and once you cap the level of spending, that allows you to really make some prioritization decisions, which is the problem that our government has. I would love to, stand here and say to people, we don't need a constitutional amendment. The government can, balance its own books. But $14.3 trillion in debt is a pretty hard number to ignore. So they evidently can't balance their own books. It needs to be forced upon them. So the cut, cap, and balance plan was what we had favored. That, unfortunately, although it passed the House, as with most things, just died in the Senate. It didn't actually get anywhere. It got tabled, and that was the end of it. And in case you're curious, Bob Casey did vote to table that, so he was not in favor of the cut, cap, and balance plan. I'm sure that you're surprised. So super committee was what we got out of it. Not a good deal, as far as we're concerned. And from anybody that I've talked to, nobody that I've spoken with thinks, hey, yeah, super committee, that sounds like it'll work, because we've never tried a giant committee to figure out how we're going to cut money, something new and novel. I think we've had 10 of them over the last 20 years or something like that. So we've tried it before; it doesn't work. But what are they supposed to do? The super committee is supposed to find at least $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction, and they have to produce their plan by November 23rd and pass it by December 23rd. I was actually just reading an article before I got here that the head of the Congressional Budget Office said, well, yeah, your deadline is the 23rd, but if you want the CBO to actually be able to score it and tell you how much money it's going to, how much money it's actually going to cut out of the budget, you need to get us those numbers towards the beginning of November. You need to get us the legislation towards the beginning of November. We're not going to be able to do what we need to do. So already, there's kind of bumps in the roads coming up, so they'll have less time to try and hammer out this grand compromise, which... So the other thing that they can do, in absent the super committee coming up with $1.5 trillion in cuts, is pass a very watered-down version of the balanced budget amendment. As with most things in life, the devil's in the details when it comes to balanced budget amendments. Certain language in balanced budget amendments will preclude the government from raising taxes in order to balance the budget. This balanced budget amendment doesn't include that language, so they can balance the budget by raising taxes. So, just to kind of give you an idea, it's always important, like any contract that you have when you're doing something, you got to know what you're signing, and that was one of the details. So, why are we kind of interested in the taxation level? There's a variety of reasons. Part of it is growth related. The more money you take out of the economy and take away from people who have shown that they can make good business decisions, that's why they are in a position to run companies or own companies. That's because they're kind of savvy when it comes to money and making good investments. The more money you take away from them and give to the government, which can't get out of its own way to be successful at anything that it tries to do, the less money there is to actually produce economic growth. So that's really the crux of it. One of the things that people will talk about, and I'm sure you've heard it, as I have, is that we need for the wealthy to pay their fair share. They need to pay their fair share. We need a fair tax system. Just so you have an idea as to what the current tax system does, and this chart, I really like it. It's one of my favorite ones. It's in the presentation, so be sure to check it out. The top 1% of earners, of income tax payers, pays 38% of all income taxes. So I'm not sure how much more fair you're looking for, but the top 1% paying 38% does pretty well. And when you get into between the top 5%, so everything from 5% up through that top 1%, they're actually picking up over 50%, 59%. So it's a lot of money that those top 5% of people are actually putting into the economy. And you hear top 5%, most people would, or at least the media would have you believe that they're incredibly wealthy. It's under $200,000. That goes down through $200,000. So it's a pretty the top 5% isn't quite as glamorous as what people would have you believe when it comes to what people are making. So that's part of the reason that we want to try and stay away from the taxes. The top percentages are already paying a fairly significant amount, but at the same time, if you look at just what the numbers say according to the IRS, basically 47, 48% of Americans don't pay any taxes at all. Yeah, Debbie Wasserman Schultz will disagree with me that that's not true, but you can go to the IRS and it's a fact. 47% of Americans don't pay income taxes. So that's just, and when you have 47% of people spending the money that is earned by the other 53%, once you kind of switch that balance, you're able to really get into some very destructive things in terms of wealth redistribution. Not that we're doing anything right when it comes to wealth redistribution right now, and that the government redistributes a lot of wealth. But be that as it may, it can get much worse depending on kind of what track we go down. At this point in American history, regardless kind of what anybody else may say, we are at a kind of an inflection point. We can go the way of the America that was, or we can go the way of social democracies, Scandinavian countries. And that is in large part, according to the left, not a bad thing. But if you look at it in terms of liberty, if you look at it in terms of opportunity, it is an incredibly bad thing. These countries, the social democracies, the soft socialist countries, are, their unemployment rates are anywhere between 10 and 15% on a normal basis. And for us being at 9%, that's an abnormal thing, at least in recent history. For them, that's kind of par for the course. But that's not what we're looking towards. If that's the avenue we go down, that's what we'll end up with. But that's not obviously why any of you are here today, because you're not hoping to see that happen. So getting back to the super committee for a second, what happens if they fail? If they fail, some bad things happen. If the plan and the watered-down balanced budget amendment fail, then $1.2 trillion in cuts will be taken evenly from security and non-security spending between the years 2013 and 2021. And when I say evenly, that means half of it will actually go to security spending. So $600 billion will be cut from security, and $600 billion will be cut from the rest. On a percentage basis, if you look at what the percentages are in terms of what percentage of the budget goes to security spending versus non-security spending, the percentage of the budget that goes to security spending is much smaller than the percentage of the budget that goes to non-security spending. And that's actually been the case for quite some time. As of 2010, the percentage of GDP that we spend on security, on military, on national defense is 5%. The percentage that we spend on entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is at 10%. So we actually spend a greater percentage of GDP on entitlement programs than we do on national defense. Yeah?
What do we spend on welfare for illegal immigrants?
I don't have the numbers quite broken down in that way. I just have the broad basis. And for those of you watching at home, the question was, what is for welfare and illegal immigrants, what percentage of it is that? I don't know. That's not numbers that I have.
They don't pay taxes.
That is correct.
How did we get to calling Social Security and those things entitlements? I really resent that very much.
I would have to agree with you.
Well, how do we correct this? Because I call talk shows all the time and correct them because I'm tired of them making me out like a welfare person here. I put my money into that, and I earned money that my company had, and they put money into that. So nobody gave me anything. We all earned all that money, and as far as I'm concerned,
Right.
a lot of people. So how did we get it to be called entitlements? The press, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, like with most things, it ends up happening kind of slowly. Just there's a change in the language over time. They've been referred to as entitlements for at least the last 20 years. So I mean, when
Not
it's
that I remember. I mean, I don't mean to tell you you're wrong. You're not wrong in what you're saying.
Right.
I'm not trying to debate you, but I can't ever. In the last 5 years, at the most, I could say I heard that entitlement attached to Social Security. Previous to that, in my lifetime, and I'm 74 years old, I have never heard that term that way.
It's an interesting question. I would be curious myself when the language changed as to start to refer to them as entitlements.
Well, I think people need some education.
I would agree. The current system for Social Security and Medicare, it's for people who are already enrolled in it and people who are 55 years and older. Nobody's suggesting making any changes for them. At least as far as if you look at like the Paul Ryan budget and those kind of things. All of the changes that have been suggested for Paul Ryan's plan suggested some changes to Medicare. Those would be for anybody who's under the age of 55, and that would be more so in order to put it on a sustainable fiscal path. The current setup, the way that it's currently set up, it's unsustainable. There's just not enough money out there to cover if you were to continue forward. People who are in their 40s at this point, you can't promise them benefits that they'll receive basically on the backs of people who haven't even been born yet.
When we first heard about it, the government is the one that went in there and started using it. They weren't supposed to touch it. And from what I understand, the system would have worked fine if it went along the way it was set up. Now,
Medicare,
I may be
no.
completely wrong. No, not Medicare. I'm
Social
talking about
Security, yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. So
the Social Security money has been invested in government
Treasuries.
securities. So they've spent,
trash.
so all the money that you put in has been spent. So your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids are gonna have to pay back the money that.
Well, what happened with the system that was set up originally, that it was supposed to be self-sustaining? Now,
It is self-sustaining in that there's more money coming in than there is going out. It's just that the Congress has borrowed about $7 trillion.
That's the problem. There's the problem. It was never supposed to be tampered with.
I collect history books. I got one printed in 1898. Franklin Delano Roosevelt started Social Security. His wife did not like that it was going to be in a slush fund, and she convinced him to put only your Social Security number could access your account. Franklin Delano, so that's why Social Security
the money
put
never
your
went
money
into
in,
a
and
bank.
it stayed there.
It didn't go into the treasury to
In
sit as a stack of money
1964,
on a wall.
after
It
Kennedy
was
was
replaced
killed,
with treasury notes.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to take it out of secured fund and put it in a slush fund of the democratically controlled Congress, and they spent it on killing all baby boomers in Vietnam.
Well, part of the problem is that we allow deficit spending.
No, I think the part of the problem is they screwed with the system that was there, that was fine. And,
Well-
and I don't know anything about it.
For the last 40 years, rather than, I don't want to get into the,
Yeah,
I don't know the exact timeline as to when the changes were made to Social Security that made it so that they can borrow every dollar that gets put into it. And
The only difference has been, it used to be off budget. So Social Security, payments for Social Security were not part of the federal budget. It is now a unified
So
budget.
then they changed it. Yeah,
Right, but
that's the problem.
We're just talking about semantics here. From the beginning, they were borrowing and spending the Social Security number, Social Security receipts, because they were receiving more than they were paying out. That money never just went in and they sat in a vault?
The way that the system is set up is that money that's going in pays for the people who are currently retired, and in theory, the way it was supposed to work was that any excess money was supposed to be held by the government until there was a deficit in terms of money going in versus coming out. But what they didn't do was they didn't hold on to that money.
Right.
That money, we can, when did it happen? I mean, at this point, it doesn't matter. The money's not there. At this point, the way that it's set up is the dollars that are going into Social Security from my paycheck are going out to my grandmother, to everybody who's currently on Social Security gets whatever minuscule percentage of whatever my Social Security has. And that's obviously that's a problem, because you don't actually own your Social Security account. The government has complete control over that money, and what it does is applies treasuries and special treasury notes. So we can, and that's actually something that I want to talk about in terms of who owns our debt. So I'll actually get into some of that. But suffice it to say that even if we eliminated like every dollar of national defense spending, getting back to the ideas of what are we entitled to? According to the Constitution, the government is supposed to provide for the national defense. Okay? That is one very specific and kind of, you don't have a lot of wiggle room in that they have to spend on national defense. They have to provide for the defense of the nation. If they were to turn around today and say, going back to this idea of them cutting $600 billion out of defense between 2013 and 2021, which is what will happen if the super committee fails, kind of people would have you believe that the defense budget is so large that they can just start, knocking money out of it and nobody will notice the difference, which is completely ludicrous. But to give you an idea of just how ludicrous it is, if they were to cut out all national security, all defense spending as of today, it would balance the budget for 2 years, and then all of the other entitlements would already kind of exceed that savings, and we would not have a safe country, which is problematic anyway. Part of the issue right now is if you look at some of the equipment that the military is using, if you look at it, there are men and women who are serving today who are younger than the airplanes and ships that they are serving on.
Yeah.
There are 22 cruisers. As of, I think, 2010, there were 22 cruisers in naval service in a particular class, the way that they're split up. But this particular class of Navy cruisers, all 22 of them had cracks in their aluminum superstructure. Some of the
50 years old.
Yeah, some of the engines that they're using on the FA-18, I might be wrong about which plane it is, but anyway, the one airplane that they're using was designed for around 6,000 miles of use, and they are now trying to put 40,000 or 10,000 hours of use onto it. So they've really kind of, it's like going in and buying a car expecting to get 200,000 miles out of it, and then you hit the 200,000 mile mark and somebody's saying, no, you can't get a new car yet, you got to take it up to 300,000 miles plus. So they're really kind of taxing what the equipment's capability is.
They're patching.
Pardon?
They're patching them up.
Yeah, they're patching
Taking
them up.
back and re-strengthening the wings. I can give you many examples. The Warthog's one of them. The tank killer.
Yeah.
I mean, they were going to DX that thing years ago, but all of a sudden they found a use for it, and they destroyed all the blueprints, so they can't make them anymore. So.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's
So-
a lot of misspending in the military.
There is. There's a lot of issues that need to be addressed within military spending, but the way to address them isn't by cutting their funding.
No,
There's
I'm going to get shot.
there's a lot of inefficiencies and there's a lot of red tape in the military bidding process that add cost to the process that could otherwise be reinvested in modernizing equipment, which it hasn't been. It's been going to bureaucracy. So what about the entitlements? Remember I said that that $600 billion would be cut out of the entitlement kind of umbrella, besides the $600 billion that'll be coming out of national defense spending. What would happen with that is that the Medicare payment, it would actually only get cut out of Medicare, and it would only get cut out of payments to doctors. That's the way that it's set up. They've kind of ring-fenced the rest of it, so only doctors' payments would get cut by that $600 billion over that 8-year, 9-year period. What happens when you are being paid less for, to take something? You will take less of that, whatever it is. So there is kind of there would end up being even more of an incentive for doctors not to take Medicare patients. I mean, right now with the current reimbursement rates, there's already an incentive for doctors to minimize the number of Medicare patients that they accept. But even kind of keeping that in mind, Washington has been, kind of kicking that can down the road for a long time. Pretty much every budget for the last, even in this last budget, one of the things they were talking about was passing a doc fix. We've got to pass a doc fix so we can increase the amount of money that doctors are getting, and they do it on a temporary basis so that what they can do is kind of rejigger the numbers so it looks like everything's okay. And it's not even close to being okay. So that's where that other $600 billion would come from with regards to the super committee.
You say doctors' payments and what else?
Doctors' payments and military.
I mean, was there a second thing
No.
other than?
No, it's just doctors' payments. So, going back to 1965 through the present, mandatory spending, going back to the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that spending has increased 5 times faster than discretionary spending, and military is considered discretionary spending, just for linguistics, because it sounds nicer, I guess, when you say it's discretionary. It doesn't make people feel as bad when you're cutting it. But, so mandatory spending, all of those, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those particular expenditures have increased at a pace 5 times faster than the discretionary budget has. So, kind of frittering around the edges, they'll talk about, oh, well, we'll take $100 billion out of discretionary spending. What they're really trying to do is kind of take advantage of the ignorance of people. Because $100 billion sounds like a lot of money, except when you consider it in light of that the national debt is $14.3 trillion, and that 0.3 represents the billions column. So, when they talk about cutting $100 billion over 10 years, they're nibbling around the edges. They're whistling past the graveyard is basically what it boils down to. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of what the problem is. There are just incredible structural issues, and we can't grow our way out of them at this point. The way the current tax structure is, we can't do it. There need to be some very difficult decisions that are made, and not difficult in terms of what it's going to do to people right now. It's going to be difficult because when they make the decisions, well, like you saw with the Republican, the Medicare plan, the Democratic Congressional Committee came out with their ads with, Paul Ryan throwing people's grandmothers off of a cliff and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's demagoguery, pure and simple. When you lay out the facts in front of people and you're actually able to talk to people about what the actual details are, people understand. I can't, no one's mother or grandmother or is willing to kind of put their retirement on the backs of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and those kind of things. So there's some real issues that need to be addressed. And they need to be addressed quickly, and they also need to be addressed in a manner that doesn't just nibble around the edges. And what that will mean is that there will be special interests who will come out of the woodwork to try and defend their little piece of the pie. So, getting to the idea of, remember at the beginning I mentioned that 100% number, is when you get to that 100% debt to GDP, growth slows. If you go out to, and maintain our current spending trajectory, if you go out to 2050, so less than 40 years from now, would anybody care to venture a guess what percentage we would be at debt to GDP? I hear 200. No, not even, you're way higher than that actually. It would go up to 344% debt to GDP. And that's not, it's not feasible. You can't do it.
If we continue at the rate.
If we continue at this rate, we would hit 344% debt to GDP. And Greek bonds collapsed, I think, at like 120. So the market will not allow you to borrow that much money. It would be like me, running up a credit card, going to the credit card company and saying, hey, why don't you give me another credit card? And just keep doing that. And using the credit card, each credit card to pay the interest on other credit cards. Eventually the house of cards falls down. So there's a lot of very difficult decisions that our elected officials need to make. And they need to really start to make them. Yep. It's at 100 right now. And that's just federal. So let's start talking about what we can do to try and fix the problem now that everybody's good and depressed. What can we do to fix it? Well, one of the things, what can we do in polite society to fix it?
Put Americans back to work, rebuild our inner industry.
Default.
Well,
Nothing's made in this country anymore.
That's actually not true.
Oh.
There's.
Go through your closet.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but if you look at, there are less people employed in American manufacturing now than there ever have been, but in terms of product.
Get old for a reason.
What we need to do is we need to start to get people re-engaged with the political process, which is why, we folks are out here today, which is what, despite what the popular press would have you believe, that was the reason that the Tea Party's actually, sprung up. It's because people saw the direction that the country was going. We saw that we couldn't continue down this path, and we realized that we needed to be, re-engaged. I'll be the first to admit, that 2005, when I got involved politically, I was 25 years old. So that was 7 years of me being asleep at the wheel. So, what do we do? How do we start to right the ship? Part of the problem is that it's difficult to get elected officials to make good choices. And by good choices, I mean make choices that will cut spending, get into the positive side of those issues that I mentioned at the beginning, be pro-growth, pro-free market, strong national defense, strong civil society. We need to start to get them to make decisions using the Constitution as a guidepost rather than whatever, the latest poll says. So how do we do that? What do we do, just as everyday citizens in order to kind of make that happen? That was actually one of the reasons that Heritage Action for America was set up. What we do is we take the policy analysis, as I mentioned, of the Heritage Foundation, we apply it to specific pieces of legislation that are being considered, that are being written. So what we try and do is influence not just the really big battles like the debt ceiling, like the really kind of monumental news headline grabbing stories. We also need to be sure that we're focusing on small ball, the small issues that are kind of changing the tone in Washington. And just for an example, during the debate on the continuing resolution at the beginning of the year that was funding us throughout the rest of the year, one of the amendments that was offered by the Republican Study Committee, which is the conservative Republican caucus. And by the way, we're nonpartisan. I don't care what letter you have behind your name. But the Republican Study Committee offered an amendment, which was basically an alternative budget that would have brought spending back to 2006 levels, which was roughly $2.2 trillion-ish, probably maybe a little more than that, $2.4 trillion. But it was defeated. And it was defeated because, well, we can't cut that much money. That's how much money we have. You know, and that's really what it boils down to. And I might be wrong, but in 2006, I don't remember there being a lot of stories about children starving in the streets and, you know, plagues and things like that occurring because of lack of government. So it wasn't a drastic, it was a large cut relative to what had ever been done before. But if you look at it just in terms of the raw numbers, it's not completely ridiculous to live by, you know, whatever 2006 levels were. You know, that's not crazy. It's not crazy talk, but that's how it's treated. And the reason it gets treated that way is because our elected officials kind of look at that and they think about, my God, what are the headlines going to look like? I've cut whatever program by 45%, or, you know, we've gotten rid of this program. That's what they need to do. They need to start doing those things. And the only way that they'll do them is by, you know, having their constituents talk to them. You know, the news media would have you believe that lobbyists and special interest groups are the ones who set the agenda and they get everything they want down in Washington. I'm going to tell you right now that that is not the case. While we are battling against special interests who don't have the same vision for America that we do, your voice as a constituent is more valuable to your elected officials at any level of government than any special interest group. As an example of that, one of the pieces of legislation that we looked at, we do a scorecard, and we also do key votes, so we let members of Congress know what's going to go on our scorecard, and we call up, or we email folks just like you to have them get a hold of their members of Congress to tell them, you know, here's what I want you to do, here's why I want you to do it. One of the pieces of legislation that we were looking at was a piece of legislation that was sponsored by the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. It was called the SOAR Act, S-O-A-R. And what it did, you don't have to write that down, it's not really important. But what it did was it took, there had previously been a school choice program in Washington, D.C. It was it was a voucher system. It was to get, you know, kids out of these schools where only 3% of the graduates were reading at their, you know, at their normal level. So I mean, just really bad schools. And what it did was it took money that was already allocated to those schools, because the federal government is in charge of allocating funding for Washington, D.C. schools just because they're in Washington, D.C. So what they did was, rather than allocating it to go to the schools that were failing, they sectioned off a portion of it and they set it up to be scholarships, basically. Maybe try and insert more of a free market solution into the Washington, D.C. school system. Interestingly enough, this was actually something that was in place and successful that the Obama administration defunded because. So coming out of this piece of legislation, the SOAR Act, coming out of the Education Committee, one of Pennsylvania's representatives sits on the Education Committee, who is the only member, the only Republican member of the committee to vote against it coming out of committee. Only one. We can debate why that was, but he was the only, you know, Republican member to vote against it coming out of committee. It was Todd Platts. So from York, the York area. So he voted against it. What I did, was, since this was a piece of legislation that we felt was important, I emailed, we have a network of activists And that's actually what the cards are that I gave you. That's so we can let you know when things are going on in the legislative district as well as what's happening in Washington. I emailed the folks in that area. There's about 120 of them at the time, so a pretty small number, and told them, hey, this piece of legislation is coming up for a vote. Todd Platts voted against it coming out of committee. We want to make sure that this piece of legislation passes. Would you call them up? Would you email them? You let them know that you want them to support it when it comes up for a final vote. From personal experience, whenever you ask a large group of people to do something, you usually get about a 10% response rate. So figure out of 120 people, 12 people called up or emailed or did whatever and talked to Todd Platts about this piece of legislation. When it came up for a final vote, Representative Platts was unwilling to kind of go against those 12 people. He didn't vote for the piece of legislation, which is what we would have ultimately liked, but he didn't vote against it. He abstained. One of the interesting things to kind of keep in mind is this piece of legislation was furiously opposed by the NEA, probably one of the most powerful special interest groups that's out there, the National Education Association. So here's a piece of legislation that is opposed by one of the strongest unions in the country. And a representative changes his position because 12 people tell him to change his position. So that gives you an idea of just how important, that one person really can make a difference. One person really can make a difference. Part of the problem in Washington is that, unfortunately, as much as we would like to think otherwise, they don't always know what they're voting about. They don't always know what's in front of them. So,
That's ridiculous.
I know.
What are we
It's-
paying
Nancy
her for?
Pelosi, we have to pass it first, and then we'll have time to read it.
So, now, I'm not one to typically defend members of Congress, but what I will say is that in the last Congress, the 111th Congress, over 4,000 pieces of legislation were numbered in the House of Representatives. They didn't all come up for a vote, but 4,000 pieces of legislation were actually given to the printer, printed out, and assigned a number. That's a lot of information to try and keep track of. Our Congress people do have staffers and everything like that, but occasionally the ball gets dropped. Or, more often than not, but, let's give them the benefit of the doubt.
No, I won't give them the benefit of the doubt, no.
One of the ways that we can make sure that our issues get looked at with the appropriate amount of attention is to make sure that we're being proactive. We need to call them before they do something wrong. That kind of carrot and stick approach. We need to be proactive, and that's one of the things that we work on.
You also got to catch them doing something right, so you're not always calling up and complaining about something.
Oh,
They
yeah, that'd
actually
be
do
nice,
something
I'd
good.
love that.
Catch them doing something
Yeah,
right.
Well, that's a great point.
that's the hardest part.
So, yeah, it is hard to catch them doing something
Well,
right.
this way, when they get a call or an email for you, they don't immediately go, oh, man, what the hell is going on now?
Well, maybe they're doing something wrong if they feel that attitude. They're doing a
No, but
terrible job.
I would imagine that the majority of communications from constituents are, give me,
Oh,
or
yeah.
what the hell are you doing?
So, and that's actually the give me point is a really good one. Because the other side, all the special interests who want the money that's coming out of your pocket
Right,
are in there every day with their hand out.
right.
And whenever they don't get whatever it is they want, their little bucket filled up with money, there will be negative ad campaigns against, particular elected officials and that kind of stuff. So that's why it's really important when they do the right thing for us to recognize that they did the right thing. For example, are we in Mike Fitzpatrick's
Yeah.
district? Okay.
Yeah.
Mike Fitzpatrick didn't do well on our scorecard, in the neighborhood of 50% or lower in terms of the percentage of times he voted the way that we thought was in line with conservative principles. So he did pretty not well. What we did, regardless of that, if you look at the fact that he voted for the Ryan budget, that's a good thing. And one of the things that I did, and I've done not just for Fitzpatrick, but for other members, and that Heritage Action do for members of Congress when they do the right thing, is we try and give them kind of cover fire, basically. We try and make sure that when they do the right thing, there are people from the conservative side of things at their town halls and those kind of meetings thanking them for doing the right thing. And it's an important thing to do, because if they only feel like we're going to, hit them with a stick when they do the wrong thing, then it comes down to, well, whose stick is smaller? Who's gonna hurt me less when they hit me? So what we have to do is we have to, and it's painful for me to do because I expect people to, uphold the Constitution. That's what they've sworn an oath to. So for them to do that and me to turn around and have to thank them for doing it, personally I find it to be insulting. But given the political environment and the media environment that exists, it's become an unfortunate necessity. Milton Friedman, one of Ronald Reagan's economists, came really kind of the father of supply side economics in terms of the Reagan paradigm. Had this great quote in an interview that I saw with him. He talked about the trick being getting the wrong people to do the right thing.
We need to change Congress to get off the treadmill.
No, we don't need to change Congress. Excuse me. You know, people have a great misunderstanding about this. People in Congress are in a business. They're trying to buy votes. They're in the business of competing with one another to get elected. The same congressman will vote for a different thing if he thinks that's politically profitable. You don't have to change Congress. People have a great misconception in this way. They think the way you solve things is by electing the right people. It's nice to elect the right people, but that isn't the way you solve things. The way you solve things is by making it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right things.
And that's a lot of times where we find ourselves, a lot more than we would like. That's where we find ourselves. And we get the wrong people to do the right thing by making it politically profitable for them to do it. And the idea of political profitability, as kind of nauseating as it is really an effective way to approach members of Congress. Basically what you're doing is you tell them what you want them to do. When they do it, you thank them, you write a letter to the editor, whatever, publicly. Let them know that they did the right thing. And when they do the wrong thing, you take appropriate action. You write a letter to the editor again, saying that you did the wrong thing. You call up their office, tell them that they did the wrong thing. But it's important that you have the other side of the coin covered, that when they do the right thing, we acknowledge that they did the right thing. So, one of the ways we do that is by letting people know ahead of time, hey, here's what pieces of legislation we're watching. We actually just put up 2 pieces of legislation today. One of them is actually going to force, it's in the House of Representatives, but what it would do is it would kind of negate the National Labor Relations Board decision as it relates to Boeing. So that's a piece of legislation that we just key voted today. And there was another one that I believe was on infrastructure. So what we do is we put those up, we send out alerts to the people who are in the Heritage Action kind of network of activists. And a lot of times it is really important that if you have an email address, that's the best way for us to communicate with people, just because for whatever reason, elected officials can get bad things done really quickly, but when it comes to doing good things, it takes them forever. So if we want to, kind of nip things in the bud, the quickest method of communication for us is just via email. That's just kind of the way it is. So that's one of the things that we do. One of the other things that we do is we actually, as I mentioned, we do have a scorecard system. And what we do, ours is actually a little different than most other scorecards. Rather than just looking at entire whole pieces of legislation, we actually look at the amendment process as well. And we score specific amendments that are either making a good bill better or making a good bill worse. So what we'll do is, if something is coming up that is going to kind of take the teeth out of something, we'll key vote it, and then, you know, we'll let you know how your member voted on it, and those kind of things. Just in case anybody was wondering, in the state of Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey had the highest percentage score. He came up at like 87%, and Joe Pitts had an 83%. So those were the two highest. And unfortunately, after the 83%, everybody went to failing. So everybody went to under 60%. So pretty bad showing.
Murphy was actually the worst out in Western PA.
Murphy was at a 59% out in Western PA, but it got some of the Republicans from the central part of the southeast were, you know, the high 40s. So not particularly good. One of the other things that we're doing is we're actually going to start updating it in real time, so that rather than having to wait for a year to find out, you know, what's going on scorecard-wise, we're actually going to do it on a real-time basis, or as close to real-time as we can, so people can see on a regular basis. You know.
So like baseball standing.
Yeah, more like baseball standing. It's kind of like fantasy football, but it's fantasy politics. You know, but you can't. Yeah, but you can't really pick your team as well. You're just kind of stuck. But but same idea. We want to let you know what's going on in as quick a turnaround as possible, so that you can, you know, kind of have that rapid response. When they do something wrong, you can let them know. When they do something right, you can let them know. So that's really, when it comes to activism, if you want to be effective, you have to do it frequently, because it's really about kind of building relationships with members of Congress, with members of the House and the Senate here in Pennsylvania, you know, your local township supervisors boards. The more that they can recognize you, the better off you are, the more likely you are for them to listen to what you're saying. And that doesn't just mean, you know, you call up and yell at them. You know, you have to, there are certain kind of ground rules. No matter how angry they make you, be polite. When you go to a town hall meeting, dress appropriately. You know, don't yell at them at a town hall meeting, because you'll be that crazy right-winger on the TV. So what we try and do is, it's all about how do we be effective? And one of the best routes, that the idea of, you know, you can attract more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. We try and, you know, leave a plate of honey out, but we're not afraid to kind of hit them with the fly swatter if they venture too far away from them. So that's just kind of what we've found to be the most effective. In terms of what's the best method of communicating, best mode of communication, probably face-to-face is the top. That gets you kind of the most impact, that has the greatest bang for the buck, and that's at any level of government, doing a face-to-face meeting. Out here, for your federal folks, that means you got to make sure and call them up, make sure that they're going to be at their office. Even for your state reps, that they're not in Harrisburg, you want to make sure that they're going to be out here. Or you could drive out to Harrisburg if you want. You don't have to drive down to Washington, you don't have to drive down to Harrisburg in order to talk to them. When they have hours here, talk to them while they're here. It'll get you the same reaction. But if you ever are down in Washington, stop in. You know, be sure to stop in their office. So face to face is kind of that's the pinnacle. You know, down from that, you start getting into things like telephone calls, town hall meetings, and you know, then kind of indirect communication, email. I would say probably actual handwritten letters with postage and the whole 9 yards going through the post office is probably in the neighborhood of a telephone call, because so few people actually do it. What I would suggest is that you're going to thank them for doing something, since it's not time sensitive, thank them by mail. Then, you know, they get the piece of paper and everything in the mail, they'll feel special. And that's kind of, that's the goal. You want to really have an impact, and you want to be able to kind of tailor your message. The other thing is, don't send an email while you're angry. I know Or believe me, I know. I have to, my representative is a Democrat, so I have a lot of times where I'm writing an email and I have to stop and walk away from it, and I'm just not going to send that. But at the same time, it's important for me to make sure that regardless of how I think he's going to vote on an issue, just because he's a Democrat, it's still my responsibility as a citizen to instruct him on what I want him to do. Same thing with Bob Casey. You know, I still send Bob Casey emails. I know they end up in the circular filing cabinet, but that's okay. It's my responsibility, it's my civic duty to let him know what I want him to do. And that's just how it is. That's part of the deal. So I can't write anybody off. So, you know, that's kind of getting into activism a little bit, just touching on it. And one of the things that we do through our activist network is actually send out all of our stuff gets sent out by email. And what's nice is that when you open it up, it'll actually say, hey, you know, here's what we want you to do. Click on this link. You click on the link. You put in your zip code, and it automatically pulls up a screen that says your congressman is. And there's a couple of kind of prefabricated lines, and then the rest of it you personalize. And that's the other thing that's really important. When you are doing an email, that you need to personalize it. Don't just send someone else's words. It's important that they not get 2 emails, or they not get like 100 emails that say exactly the same thing. Because all that shows them is that you were willing to press send. That doesn't necessarily communicate a level of commitment. So what I'll do is I'll take those prefabricated lines, make it specific. A great example was the most recent flooding. I live in a small town called Pine Grove, little teeny town up in southern Schuylkill County. My wife and I were actually landlocked. We couldn't drive in or out of town for 2 days. All of the roads were closed. There was just serious flooding. The National Guard was out. It was bad. A lot of my neighbors have done really bad as a result of it. One of the issues that we started to talk about was the need to offset any increases in FEMA spending with cuts elsewhere. Yes, it's an emergency, but that doesn't mean that you can just spend more money you don't have. You need to find the savings somewhere else to pay for it. That's what I have to do when I have an unexpected bill, so that's what I expect the federal government to do. So I used that experience in an email to my congressman. I said, you know, dear Representative Holden, you know, although Schuylkill County, which is the county that I'm from, it's actually the county that he's from as well, was really negatively impacted by the recent flooding. I would urge you to offset any increases in federal emergency management funding with corresponding cuts to other areas. And that's what I did. I sent it to him, I sent it to Toomey, and I sent it to Casey. So whether or not they'll listen to that, you know, it's out of my hands. But you know, I've done my part, and I personalized it. I took some of the data that we had given to people in order to use for their emails, and I inserted that, but I built an email around it. So that's an important thing to do. The other thing is time management. How are you supposed to keep up with 4,000 pieces of legislation at the federal level? The answer is you're not going to. One of the ways, one of the most effective ways for you to stay on top of issues that are important to you is to find sources that you can trust. We keep track of a whole variety of issues, and we let people know about them. You know, we'll let people know when votes are coming up that affects national debt, national defense, you know, some of the more egregious federal programs that are, you know, anti-free market. We'll keep track of them, and we let people know. There are other organizations out there that do the same thing for other issues. Second Amendment, you know, the life issues. So there are organizations that are specifically kind of geared to what your interests are. And at the state and the federal level, you know, it's just important to kind of find them. Outsource your research. And don't get me wrong, it's important, you know, once you get it, take a look at it and double check it. But, you know who you can trust. And that's the only way that we can really kind of keep up with things, just because of the sheer volume of legislation. At that, I wanted to stop talking, get a drink of water, and maybe, do we have time for some questions? Are we okay?
Yeah, a few.
A few? Okay.
But keep your comments brief, folks, because it is almost 20 after 8. We have a few other things we gotta share with you.
Okay, gentleman up here first.
We're talking about the fixes to the national debt. You said nothing about our empire. And you also said that the Congress rarely does anything that the people does not want. But my opinion is that the people does not want the empire. The empire was imposed on us. And it is a major cost of the national debt.
I'm sorry, what the...
Did you say empire?
The empire, our empire. We have 900 bases overseas, as Ron Paul said last night. We are overextended, the army is demoralized, and it is weakening this nation. It is not making it strong.
Well, I guess first off, in terms of percentages, the national defense, and that would include all of our overseas bases, actually is a smaller percentage of spending than what entitlements are. So we can look at making changes to the national defense budget, but that's not the primary driver of the problem. The primary driver of the problem is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's the major expenses, hands down. There are certainly issues that would need to be looked at as far as national defense priorities, but you know, the drivers, just in terms of the numbers, it's the entitlement system that's unsustainable. That's we spend twice the amount on a percentage basis. We spend 10% of GDP on entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and 5% on national defense. So before we start talking about cutting out that 5%, let's take a look at the 10% first before we look at anything else. Are there areas where the military can be more efficient, where they can put the money to use in a better way? Absolutely. But
I'm sorry, are you saying the national defense is 5%?
5% in terms of compared to GDP. If you look at on a GDP basis, 5% of our budget is
It's closer to 21-22% of the total budget.
5% of the GDP. If you look at what the whole gross domestic product is, 5% GDP is spent on military, 10% is spent on entitlements.
Right.
So not of the budget. Yeah, it's based on a GDP basis because budgets can fluctuate. It's easier to just kind of look at it from a solid fixed position.
GDP isn't solid and fixed either.
Well, yeah, you're right. But it's easier as a reference point because you can compare it. You can compare defense to GDP throughout time and have kind of a better reference point.
Not that I'm an advocate for him at all, but he does make an interesting point. What do you think about making a distinction between defense spending and military spending? And personally, to go along the lines of what you were saying, is if we're going to have these bases in other countries, and it does have benefit to the United States, but the home country is actually benefiting more, why not turn these things into profit centers and say, listen, it's costing us, $8 billion to keep this this base open in Germany. Germany, if you want us to stay there, pay us $10 billion so that it offsets the cost. We collect additional revenue, or let them do their own defense.
I don't know about Germany. They should do it. We have another question?
Yeah, interesting.
I totally disagree with you, but...
Yeah, it was a question. What do you thought of that?
Okay.
Concept?
Yes, ma'am.
I had a couple questions, but the one of the
So you want to know Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which one has the biggest slice of the pie?
They're almost
They are. Actually, Medicare, it looks like Medicare has a slightly higher percentage than Social Security.
but not dramatically. It's about a third each, right?
Medicaid and the Obamacare subsidy program are probably the smallest. I don't actually have the straight percentages, I just have a graph that I'm looking at. And the way that it's set up, I can't actually tell you the hard number. But it looks like Medicare is slightly larger than what Social Security is.
Okay, and the reason why I was asking, because I thought early on with the Obamacare that a great amount of the percentage or money would be going into Medicaid because Medicare was going to be reduced.
But weren't the states required to pick up a bigger portion of the Medicaid?
Yeah, states are. Yeah, once you get into like the funding mechanics on Medicaid and that kind of stuff, then you start looking at what is the state's portion of Medicaid spending. So I mean, if you looked at what the entire, I honestly don't know, but if you were to probably, I would say that if you looked at the state portion and the federal portion of it, kind of combine those two together, they would probably all be roughly equivalent in terms of what the percentages were. But that's just a guess. I mean, from what it looks like, Medicare is the highest percentage, followed by Social Security, and then Medicaid, just the federal portion of it, would be the smallest. But out of all of them, you're still kind of adding up to a fairly significant dollar amount. So.
And the other little question, without taking too much time, would be other 47%. I know that you mentioned that part of that is welfare recipients. Who would be the other that would make up the 47%?
Oh, that aren't paying
That don't
taxes.
pay taxes.
It's actually, a lot of that stuff kind of is because of the quirks in our tax code. It would be to people who are, anytime there is a refundable tax credit, whether it would be a child care tax credit, what are some of the other ones? The mortgage interest rate tax credits, and those kind of things that can actually give you a negative amount where the government, where you're owed more than what you paid simply because of you did like energy efficient improvements to your home or whatever. So there's actually that's where those come in. Mm-hmm.
Leo, what would you, as far as face-to-face, is going to be best, phone calls, handwritten letters, where would you think that, like, petitions signed, with signatures on them, like, like from our group or something?
Well,
they hold any water?
Less than people would like.
Really?
Yeah, it would actually be more effective rather than sending, like a petition from this group with, 50 signatures on it. It would be more effective to send 50 letters.
Really? Or make 50 phone calls?
Or make 50 phone calls, 50 emails. Part of the reason for that is if you look at a petition, there's no way for them to verify that you actually A, read, or B, signed the petition. There's also it's difficult for them to know just based on a signature that you actually are their constituent.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is kind of another point. If you are going to call, email, do all of those things, do it with your representative or senator. Me calling
your
up,
address and phone number so they can call.
yeah. Me calling up Barbara Boxer from California or whatever isn't going to do anything.
Well, no, that's what I was referring to, really, to people from, a particular district.
Yeah. It's more is better. So if you can get, even if you can get 10 people to call versus 50 people on a petition, I'd say 10 phone calls would probably be carry more weight than 50 people signed on a petition.
Other question, real quick, I had to do, what is it called, baseline spending?
Baseline budgeting.
Budgeting, that's the word. Now, what's going on with that? Is there anything to get rid of that? Because it seems like, you know, they keep talking about cuts, but what was
They're
it going
not.
up like 8% a year?
Yeah,
Or some stupid thing?
Yeah, baseline budgeting is an interesting topic. Is anybody here not familiar with baseline budgeting? Okay, what baseline budgeting is the way that it's set up is, let's say I expected you to give me $100, okay? But you only gave me $80. Under baseline budgeting, I could say that you took $20 from me. And that's how government budgets. What they do is they expect a certain percentage increase, and any percentage increase below that is considered a cut.
So for example, the cuts in spending that they've been talking about,
Yeah.
those are not actual
No.
cuts like we would think of it. They're reductions in the increases.
Right, yeah, they slow the increase rather than actually cutting anything. So they're really getting more money than they got last year, but they can sell it they can call it a cut
That's
because
lying.
we have baseline
That's
budget.
about basically lying. All they ever do is lie.
Yeah, and that's the kind of point that I think is important to bring up to like our congressman, for those of you who are in Fitzpatrick's area, because he did vote for the final debt ceiling bill, and basically, as I understand it, if I understand correctly, the the spending cuts that are in that are all a part of this baseline budgeting, where they're really not cutting the actual money that's going to anything.
Yeah, I think the percentage cut in 2012, or the dollar amount was like $12 billion in cuts in 2012, and then the rest of it was through the future. So, and really the only year that they ever have control over is this year.
That's right.
So anything else is just kind of wishful thinking,
Right.
because no current Congress can bind a future Congress. So,
Well, when put that into effect?
baseline budgeting?
Yeah,
It's been around since the 70s.
Yes, I think the 70s.
They used to do 5-year budgeting, now they're doing 10-year budgeting. So they can say, we're cutting $100 billion, which if they actually did it flat, it would be $10 billion per year for 10 years. But they can make it sound like they're cutting enormous amounts of money
Right.
over an entire, long period of time.
Mike, you got a question? Take another question.
I was just wondering, you said that write and communicate with your elected officials. Do you have any idea of if Obama gets the messages we sent him?
I think they become part of the official record, but I'm not sure. For the president, I don't know whether or not.
I'm sure somebody's putting.
I'm
those
sure
details
somebody's
somewhere.
looking at them, but I don't know how far up the
Not
line
on
they
the
get
A-list,
past.
let's put it that way.
Okay, so I'm where I was before.
Yeah, I would
Those
say,
paper shredder's working.
Yeah.
Keep sending me stuff to.
I would say your efforts would be better served. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've written the president, not this president, but other presidents, about things. But really, because we're the power of the purse in the legislative process, you're going to get the most bang for your buck out of members of Congress and the Senate.
You're not gonna change their
But
minds.
isn't it also better to send postcards, because otherwise the sealed letters have to be opened, because they might have anthrax?
Oh, my God.
No.
Oh, I have no idea. I mean,
Once-
security procedures and that kind of stuff, I really don't. I don't
One
know.
suggestion I would make is keep each correspondence to a single subject and make it really concise.
Yeah.
Don't add a lot of prose to it.
Right.
If you want to have, links to websites and stuff like that, put the links in there, but, don't send him like a 10-page email. He's just not going to read it. So, if you watch O'Reilly, he gets letters and he just puts up, 1 or 2 sentences from that. That's what you're looking at. You want to make it real simple. Don't want you to do this. Want you to do that. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, bullet
Anyway.
points.
Bullet points, 3, no more.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Leo. We appreciate your time. It's great to see a young person.
Yeah,
And
it is.
if you fill out that
This
card, you
involved.
can just hand it to me, you don't have to mail it in. Great.
The Heritage Action cards that are on your seat, feel free.